I am joined by my friend and colleague Kabir Khanna. He's the director of elections and analytics at MS Now. When you see me working at the big board and describing what's going on, he's the brains of the operation. He's the one who sort of assembles that data, curates it, analyzes it, trying to make sure that it's accurate. If I tell you that there's been a call that someone is determined to have moved ahead or won a particular race, it's only because Kabir says so. So he knows all the data behind it. And Kabir, nice to have you here. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. And as usual, you're being way too generous. It's a team effort. We're all pouring through the data together, figuring out what the important stories are to tell our audience.
You're determining whether it's accurate and trustworthy and meets our standards. And then I'm trying to put a little flesh on the bones and try to understand it. Last night was an interesting example. It was Arizona, not our typical primary night because you didn't get results until 11 p.m., which is when my show goes on. But we had results at 11:02, and I think by 11:08, we had the most important results. There were a number of races there, but I would say that the two that stood out to me were the gubernatorial race, the Republican gubernatorial race, because the Democrat is the governor, Katie Hobbs. She used to be the Secretary of State, and the race for the Secretary of State. Again, the Republican race for the Secretary of State. They'll be running against Adrian Fontes, who is the Democratic Secretary of State right now. Arizona is one of those unusual states in which the Secretary of State, until the rules change later this year, is the second in command. They don't have a lieutenant governor. So the question in Arizona is, this is the guy who's going to be running against Adrian Fontes. His name is Alexander Kolodin. He was running against a woman named Gina Swoboda. The polling seemed to support the idea that Kolodin was going to win. He won very handily. Kolodin and the person who won the race to be the Republican running for governor are election deniers. And a lot of our viewers will associate Arizona Republicans with being election deniers, certainly in recent years. But it's so interesting to me because Arizona has one of the richest conservative Republican traditions in this country, and it's got a lot of things going for it. It had John McCain going for it. It had essentially the invention of mail-in and absentee voting. I mean, it was in place in other places, but Arizona is the place that for the last 30 years, you don't have to have any excuse. Everybody gets a ballot. I think it was 87% of people who voted last night voted in advance. And that's typical. In fact, that number is a little low. Sometimes it's above 90%. So there's a bit of a problem going on in the Republican Party in Arizona. Tell me a bit about this.
Yeah, so Kolodin won the Secretary of State race. As you said, the first call we got last night was in the gubernatorial primary, where another prominent election denier, Andy Biggs, former chair of the House Freedom Caucus, won handily. So this is actually a good moment to maybe educate our audience a little bit about how the vote count works in Arizona. The polls actually closed at 10, but the counties hold their votes for an hour until everyone's ready to report. And then you get a big batch of votes right away at 11 p.m. Eastern for the primary. And that enabled several calls, including the Andy Biggs call for governor.
By the way, with 34% of the vote in, if you can see in the top corner there, it's now much more than that, but that call was made. The first dump of votes was 34%. That's how it works in Arizona. You get like a big chunk, and on the basis of his lead at that point, the AP was able to project that he would be the winner.
Yeah, the lead was insurmountable. We had actually seen just Maricopa County at first, and that's the Phoenix area. That is the most populous county in the state and where the bulk of votes are cast in both party primaries. Maricopa is also ground zero for a lot of the election denial efforts in Arizona.
Cyber Ninjas, remember them?
Right. Cyber Ninjas was the firm Republicans got to conduct an audit, in quotes, of the 2020 election. After much hand-wringing and a lot of effort, they found no evidence of fraud whatsoever. And I believe Cyber Ninjas actually folded not long after that.
Well, they weren't in this business to start with, which was a little odd. If you're going to bring in a third party to examine your voting, which, I think let's just pause for a second. Most states, if not every state, have audit systems of their voting, right? Like it's sort of built in. That's what in most states, it's what the Secretary of State does. They don't just administer elections, they check to see whether the election systems work, the machines work, the voting works, the infrastructure works, whether non-citizens are voting. I mean, as a habit, Republican and Democratic states do that in America.
Yeah, there are a lot of systems. There's a canvas, there are post-election audits, there are paper trails. People, election officials have been doing this for a long time. They're by and large not partisan. They don't have agendas. They're professionals doing the best they can in kind of politically difficult circumstances. But you raised an important point, which is that Arizona has a history of voting by mail and voting in advance of Election Day, and it's bipartisan. The vast majority of voters
in Arizona by Republicans, passed and signed by a Republican governor, but bipartisan.
Both sides of the aisle like voting ahead of Election Day. And what's interesting is often you'll see different types of voters vote well in advance of Election Day versus the voters who vote a little closer to Election Day or even drop off their mail ballot on Election Day. All that said, Colliden, the gentleman you mentioned who won the Republican primary for Secretary of State, he's trying to make it harder to vote in advance, including potentially doing away with the permanent early voter list in the state. This is someone who is at the center of the efforts to overturn the 2020 election. As you described, it's someone our colleagues at VoteBeat, who are very sober-minded in their analysis, they call him a bomb-throwing attorney, as opposed to the candidate he beat, Gina Swoboda, who's more of a rules-following, pragmatic elections administrator. So the thing is, there's clearly an appetite within the GOP base in Arizona and nationwide to elect these types of candidates. But this is a seat that could be competitive. They had a chance to flip this seat this November. And while they still have a chance, I do think electing these kinds of candidates is going to make it harder because there are lots of independents, there are lots of moderates, and this stuff doesn't play with them the way it does with
let's mine this a little
voters.
bit. It was a clean sweep, in fact, last night of election deniers. On the Republican Party, pretty much every major office was taken by an election denier.
Yep.
Same thing happened in the last election in Arizona. And yet, what it resulted in is that statewide offices were all won by Democrats. Some of them were close, but they were all won by Democrats. So the base seems to be involved in the civil war in the Republican Party. But the voter in Arizona, who by and large is conservative and or independent. It's a swing state, but it's a pretty conservative place generally speaking. They don't really buy into this nonsense. The larger voting crowd doesn't buy into this nonsense. So the current Secretary of State, who I had on last night, Adrian Fontes, a Democrat, he was the county recorder in Maricopa County. He was thought to have handled the counting in that district well. He actually ultimately lost his election. But when he won his election as Secretary of State, he won with a good amount of Republican support. And there were a lot of Republicans in Arizona who voted for Democrats because they didn't like the Kari Lakes of the world and these sort of Abe Hamadeys, these election deniers. They thought, look, win or lose on the votes, win or lose on the merits, not this way.
Yeah, the way I think about Arizona is it is a purple state these days, but if you just look at their party registration, Republicans consistently outnumber registered Democrats. So that's sort of like the fundamentals of the electorate there. But there are a contingent of Republican registrants who are willing to cross party lines and vote Democratic. It's in part how Joe Biden won the state narrowly in 2020. It's how Mark Kelly won fairly handily in 2022, and some of these other races you're talking about that Democrats prevailed in. So in 2022, for example, that was actually a fairly favorable environment for Republicans nationwide. But they were swept in Arizona. Kari Lake lost the gubernatorial race. They lost the Senate race.
She doesn't quite agree that she lost the gubernatorial race. That's the other problem in Arizona, right? People don't do that thing that you're supposed to do where when you lose, you phone up or, you talk to the person who won and you move on. Kari Lake fought that for a long time.
She did, but reality would dictate that she in fact lost, and they lost the Secretary of State race fairly handily too. In some ways, it's remarkable how close Kari Lake came that year. She then went on to run again in 2024 and for Senate and lost again. But I guess the point is this this is a competitive state. These are competitive statewide races in the general election. And I do think that Republicans are making it harder to win those offices and flip some of them by electing candidates like this. Frankly, at this point, I would say the gubernatorial race is a lean Democratic contest at this point. Katie Hobbs would be favored to win re-election against a conservative election denier like Andy Biggs.
She only came to prominence because she was the Secretary of State, who again was fighting against the election denialism of the 2020 election. Jillian Frankel, MS Now's Jillian Frankel was out talking to some voters in Arizona about this ahead of the vote. Listen to what she had to say.
What do you make of hearing politicians talk about 2020 fraud claims?
It's bullshit. I mean, we can count the vote, and we should allow everybody to vote and make sure everything is counted honestly. And I don't believe in rigged.
Get over it. You lost. Get over it. You're like a child.
It's like, come on, that's foolishness, and no, that's just a waste of time, and I don't like that.
It's sad that someone that doesn't win just claims that it was all a sham. But if he would have won, would he have also claimed it was a sham? Probably not.
Well, which is actually a fact, right? I mean, Donald Trump, when he wins elections, they're honest, and when he doesn't win elections, they're not honest. And one thing I was waiting for last night is what happened in California, where you and I knew, and we shared with the viewers, everybody who knows how voting works in California knows that you could wait hours, if not days, to get results. It's just the nature of the way they vote and the way they count, and that's what it is. It's not an indication that anything's wrong. Even last night, with this whole idea that voting ends at 10 o'clock, and yet no results come out at 11, some people started floating the idea that, what is it they're doing in that hour? Are they manipulating the votes? Have they counted them and they're doing this? I mean, it's so strange because Arizona has such a strong history of voting by mail successfully. It has no excuse absentee voting. You do not have to say that you were on a trip. I mean, even in New York, you got to give some excuse. You're a caregiver or whatever the case is. In Arizona, you haven't had to. And it worked for 3 decades. And then all of a sudden, Arizonans were asked to disbelieve what they knew to be true. That there was no problem in Arizona, and generally in states that conduct these audits, Utah, Georgia, Michigan, the number of people, I don't know what problem we're solving for, but the number of people, for instance, non-citizens who vote is infinitesimal. It's statistically not really a number. And I remind everybody that if you, it's an offense to say that you're eligible to vote and to cast a ballot. So some people register accidentally and don't vote, but if you're an undocumented immigrant and you deliberately cast a ballot in this state, knowing that it's in this country, knowing it's illegal, you're going to lose your status. You're going to get thrown out and probably charged criminally.
Right. It sort of defies logic. Like, what's the reason someone would do this?
Right.
I mean, we can even get into what's going on in New Jersey if you'd like, but I just want to make the point about Arizona that people vote in advance and by mail because it's convenient, Republicans and Democrats alike. You're lowering the barriers to voting. And in state after state where they adopt this method of voting, we see an uptick, cycle after cycle, year after year. More and more people adopt it, and it kind of proliferates. Most of the races last night were not very close, and they were callable in that 11 p.m. hour Eastern when you were on air. But there was actually one primary last night that we're still waiting on a projection from the AP. That's a Democratic primary in Arizona's 1st district. It's the Scottsdale area. We got a call in the Republican primary there. But in the Democratic primary, what we're seeing is that each batch of votes that drops in this after Election Day period, so in the wee hours of the morning going into today, the trailing candidate starts to catch up a little bit. So this is what we saw in places like California, like the LA mayoral race, where a candidate actually was catching up, and she was in 3rd place and eventually jumped into 2nd place in the final count. So the reason the AP hasn't called this Democratic primary in Arizona 1 is they're just making sure that even if this trend continues, then there's no way that the result could flip and that the trailing candidate will eventually run out of runway, that is ballots left to count,
because the
to make
AP
up the gap.
And us and these nonpartisan people who run elections and these elected people who are county recorders and stuff like that, we all share one interest. Whatever your political views are, we work, and that the government puts their finger on the scale, or the media is in the pocket of the government, or a place like Iran. I mean, Iran's a great example. It's everybody votes. It's actually a democracy. Everybody votes, but you can't run if you're not authorized by the government to run, and you have to, it's a very high bar. So there might be two people running against each other, but they fundamentally share the same views, and you vote, because if you don't vote, you get in trouble for not voting. I mean, I like the concept of mandatory voting, the way they have it in Australia, where you get a fine or something. That's not how it works in Iran. If you don't show up to vote, bad things can happen to you. I'm not looking for that kind of thing. So the point is, to have a system that people trust, like Arizona's in particular, it's hard earned, right? That was decades of getting it right every single time, and now it's being undermined. And clearly, enough people believe it that these election denier candidates are winning in primaries. As you point out, they may not win in the election as a result. They certainly didn't win in the last election, although some of those races took some days to call because they were pretty close.
Absolutely. I mean, we come across and interact with elections officials in the course of our work. And as I said, they're by and large hardworking people who put aside their own political opinions in order to try to get it right.
Yeah.
And if that means holding results across the state for an hour after polls close so that all counties are ready to report, that's what they'll do. If it means that it takes a few days to figure out who's going to win a really close race, as has happened in Arizona in recent history, that's what they're going to do. And we're going to have to be patient because it's also in our interest to get it right. And as you say, that this is in primaries. We need to remember that Republican voters are not monolithic, particularly not in Arizona, where you have McCain Republicans and conservative-leaning voters who aren't on board with this. And those are swingy voters.
Richer. He was the Maricopa County recorder. That's the person
Stephen Richer.
And he, by declaring that the election was fair in 2020, he raised the ire of a whole bunch of these people, and he would hold town halls, and he put glass so that you could see how the machines were counted. He invited Arizonans to watch the process. Say, don't trust me, trust your own eyes. And they still voted him out. In
a primary.
I mean, so the thing's not finished there.